we will have testimony from Sarah Nayani and her daughter Annika about their experiences delivering food for families in Pathways Forest Ridge building.
So thank you for inviting us to come and talk. We would second what John said about feeling useful. So we felt really useful when Wendy reached out to us. We wanted to be useful during the pandemic, and like all of us, I think we felt disconnected and not of much use. And Wendy asked us if we could come and help with the Breakfast Club. And we were delighted. And I said, Wendy asked, you know, would Annika and Rohan be interested to come along as well? And we said yes. So we came and we went every Saturday. Sometimes we tried to help Wendy by saying, Wendy, you don't need to come this week. We'll do it. And we would get all the food together and pack it. And every time we said to Wendy, you don't need to come this week, we'd lock ourselves into a closet or lose the keys or something. And then we'd have to call Wendy and say, no, Wendy, we're so sorry. We're locked out or in or somewhere. And she'd say, okay, we have to call this person. So other than minor mishaps like this, we felt this real sense of doing something of value for these families. And actually, because of the pandemic, we couldn't see them. They couldn't come in for breakfast, which was why Wendy had stepped in and used the money from UCM to provide food for these families. So they would go out on a Thursday or a Wednesday and go to No Frills and get the flyers and try and get as much food as they can and to make it as varied as possible. So there would be waffles one week and there would be something special each week, and there was always fruit. And then Wendy got extra good at couponing, and next thing you knew, there were eggs, and then there was, you know, they were all over the place filling up these bags of shopping. And then finally, there was some help from the YMCA, and this bounty of food came. And we were very much aware that these food deliveries weren't really just for the children and the families. These were probably helping everyone in the family to be able to eat over that pandemic period. And there's one family in particular who had just a family with 4 little children, and you could see that mom was on her own and was really struggling. We would knock on the door, Annika and I would knock on the door on a Saturday morning with this bounty of food, because we were mindful that some of the larger families needed a bit more. And she was just, sometimes I think we were the only people that she had seen, and really other than Wendy, she was the only person that we were seeing on a regular basis. And one day we just couldn't take it any longer. She grabbed us and we hugged, and we hadn't hugged anyone for a year and a half. Not even, we hadn't hugged grandparents or friends, or even Wendy. I'm sure Wendy was slightly relieved, but you know, we'd see Wendy and we all wanted to hug each other, but we couldn't because of the pandemic. So it was probably in some ways even more special for us to be involved in something like this that had meaning over such a difficult time. And so worth supporting, and frustrations that it's not a charity, it's part of this not-for-profit and this strange legal situation with money and funding and the Unitarian Church and what we can support. And so none of these easy grants that you can apply for your charity are available. They really require often Wendy's resourcefulness to make sure that the families are fed. And I know at the moment we're back in a not getting food from YMCA, and so it's going to rely entirely on UCM donations. So I just wanted to speak to how nice it was for us over that period to feel this connection and to see Wendy and to feel like we were doing something valuable, and what an important thing it is that these churches and religious groups are supporting Pathway. And I know Annika might have a word or two that she would like to say.
I remember when we first started going to Pathways, there were more people helping out, and it kind of got like there was less people, and just we were meeting so many new faces, and it's like everyone was so happy, and just such a great place to be. And some of these families, like their weekly groceries is what they needed and didn't have enough to feed their kids in the morning, which is pretty amazing.
So thank you everyone at UCM who supports Pathway, and a big thank you. I know I don't think anyone could really appreciate how much work Wendy puts into it. She's here, there, and everywhere, and every time the ball gets dropped, Wendy's there, you know, shifting boxes of food around and crates of apples and things. So big thank you to Wendy for thinking of us at that time, and we're just so grateful to be involved in the church in this way. So, but yes, definitely worth supporting.
It is my privilege now to introduce our speaker, Denise Davy.
First off, thank you so much for allowing me to come here this morning and share Margaret's story with you. I know we live in different cities, but unfortunately the same sad situation around homelessness is evident in all cities across Canada. And as John mentioned, it's gotten worse during the pandemic. I like to start out by showing this video of Margaret because it reminds us that she and all homeless people are someone's son or daughter, someone's sister or brother, and that each one of them started out as a child, and they had lots of potential and promise, and somewhere along the way they were seriously let down. And I'll tell you a little bit about Margaret's story. So who was Margaret? I met Margaret on a cold winter night at a shelter in Hamilton many years ago. I was actually there on assignment writing a story for the Hamilton Spectator, and my goal was to write a simple one-page story the next day. That happened, but much more happened after that. It was around midnight, freezing cold night, like I said, in January. The shelter was already packed with people, and a cloud of smoke had formed already from all the cigarette smoke. I'd interviewed a few women and men, and noticed a woman across the room hunched over on one of the rickety wooden benches. I actually had to squint to make sure I was seeing what I was actually seeing, because she was so worn down that I describe her in my book as looking like an inmate from a Victorian workhouse. And the front photo from the book is actually the night I saw her, the night I met her. She had matted hair, gray, leathery, very lined skin. I guesstimated that she was in her 70s and was absolutely shocked to find out that she's actually, in this picture, she's 49 years old. That's what living on the streets does. So the question that swirled in my mind, and I'm sure you've all thought of it, and anybody who's ever seen a homeless person on the streets, ask yourself, how could this have happened? How could this person have fallen into this tragic state, especially in a country like Canada, where we expect a little bit more? We're supposed to be looking after our most vulnerable. So a staffer told me she'd been coming to the shelter for more than a decade. When I asked if she thought I should interview her, she said, warned me against it. She actually had a habit of smashing people over the head with their melamine coffee cups. And she said she'd likely had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but had not been in medication for years and years and years. And she'd never really talked to anyone there, even though she'd been coming for about a decade. I decided to take a chance. I had to find out this person's story. And I really felt like if she was being violent with people, and maybe it was a defense mechanism, and it probably because she had been attacked or assaulted at some point. So I felt like if I was kind to her, we could get along. And fortunately, it did work out that way. To everyone's surprise, she completely opened up and told me her story. You probably couldn't hear it that well in there, but she had been born in Barbados. Her parents were Canadian Pentecostal missionaries. She taught Sunday school classes. She played the accordion and piano as a teenager. And she'd even worked for a while as a young adult when she was as a typist. I noticed she never looked at me when she spoke. Her cigarette was always close by. Her cigarette was her best friend. And whenever I asked her about her stay in the hospital, because staff had told me she'd been in the local Hamilton Psychiatric Hospital, she always shut down. And so I never quite found out what happened to her after her adolescent years. What I did find out, though, is that her stay in the hospital had been a long and torturous one, and her journey to becoming a homeless person had been torturous. I absolutely had to find out what had happened. So the next day I called the hospital where she'd been a patient and asked if I could possibly see her medical files. And they said if she signed some forms that I could access them. And I walked into the hospital library and was met with 869-page file. That was, honestly, it was even bigger than this. I had to have it all put together and bound. And through her files, I learned Margaret's true story, that she had gone into the hospital as a sweet, innocent 19-year-old girl and come out 24 years later, much, much sicker than she'd gone in, which is the opposite of what we expect of our hospital system. And the answer to what had happened to her and so many thousands and thousands of others was found in one word: deinstitutionalization, one very long word. And that was basically the closure of psychiatric hospital beds and the eventual closure of entire psychiatric hospitals. So this began in the 1960s, and in the time that it ended, about 20 plus years later, more than 80% of psychiatric hospital beds were closed across Canada. It's not that closing them was a bad idea. Moving them into the community could mean that they could lead more productive lives. Some could even find jobs. It was all possible due to the introduction of new medications that had come in. But in order for this move to work, they would have to provide supports like community services and housing in the community. Unfortunately, the community services, the mental health clinics, and the supportive housing never materialized. The outreach workers, the nurses, the social workers that were all promised were never hired. As a result, legions of patients like Margaret, who were discharged from these hospitals, went into the community with almost zero supports. And like Margaret, they eventually ended up on the streets. So Margaret was actually admitted to the hospital in 1961, way back. Like I said, she was only 19. And it was just the time when deinstitutionalization was really getting into full swing. Her parents actually, once they admitted her to the hospital, moved to the States. So she had nobody to advocate for her, no supports at such a young age. So she was actually discharged into her first rooming house, a boarding house. That's where they sent them at the young age of 21. It's not that life in the hospital wasn't perfect for Margaret, but at least she had 24/7 care. She had a roof overhead. She had 3 meals a day. And probably most important, she had people to make sure that she stayed on her medication. So her symptoms were kept at bay, and she was actually doing quite well in there and wanted to stay. But once she was moved into these rundown rooming homes with no support, the operators were pretty much business owners. She quickly went off her medication and would spiral into homelessness. So to say that this move of patients into the community was a failure is a huge understatement. Margaret was once found in the basement of an apartment building eating garbage out of a dumpster. And she told doctors she'd been there for about 2 years. And that was one of the worst occasions. And I have to say, sifting through the 869 pages, those were the toughest pages to read, is the moments that she came back and they described the horrible condition she was in, sometimes in a catatonic state, covered in bruises. And this is Margaret's story. I was able to access her files. This is the story of thousands of people across Canada that has never really been told. So during the 24 years that Margaret was hospitalized, she was discharged into these homes more than 9 times. And each time ended more disastrously than the one before, because her health, mental and physical, was gradually being eroded with each of these moves. But that's how strong the move was to close these beds, was that despite the fact she came down in this really ragged condition, she would come back in this horrible condition, they just kept discharging her. So as hundreds of hospital beds across Canada were closed, hundreds of psychiatric patients ended up on the streets. And it created what we see today, is a subculture of mentally ill homeless people within our, and how many people do you know who say, I don't remember this problem decades ago. It didn't exist. It was created because of this deinstitutionalization. And we don't know, and will likely never know, the full extent of the damage created by it, because this is what really shocked me. There was almost zero follow-up on patients once they left. I mean, now you do get doctors or nurses or social workers following up, seeing how you're doing, need any home supports. Back then, people were discharged into these rundown homes with, like I said, business owners as the operators, and it was inevitable of what would happen to them. So after 24 years of this back and forth and being moved around, Margaret decided she'd had enough. She'd endured countless electroshock treatments. Like I said, she'd been moved in and out so many times. She decided on her own to turn her back on all forms of institutional care, and she became homeless. She slept at shelters, she ate hot meal programs at churches and agencies, and she became so well known and liked that they actually nicknamed her Princess Margaret, which was a very sweet name for a difficult situation. So because the only mental health system we had was dismantled, the results of deinstitutionalization, as I said, have really been disastrous. The government also decided, as you know, to cut funding to affordable and supportive housing beginning in the 1980s. And so those two factors combined really created the crisis we see today on our streets. And it's why about 70% of homeless people today have a mental illness. I got that statistic from Canadian Mental Health Association, but I think in just having visited shelters and talked to a lot of homeless people myself, that the number is closer to 80 or 90%, because if they don't have a mental illness that contributed to them becoming homeless, that they often develop one, because it's such a cruel, hard life, brutal life, really, to live on the streets. So this lack of supports that I'm talking about, though, it doesn't just affect people who are homeless, because people who are housed face huge wait times for mental health services because the supports simply aren't there. There's a huge waiting list of 1 or 2 years for simple programs for even children's anxiety and that sort of thing. As a result of all this, today, more than 235,000 people are homeless in Canada. And on any given night, 35,000 people are sleeping on the streets. That's, again, the official number. When I consider the fact 8,000 people a night are living in shelters in Toronto, I actually think the number is higher than that. They sleep in our parks, they're in the alleys, they're in the store doorways, downtowns, they're in cardboard boxes in cemeteries. And one of the reasons I felt so compelled to write my book was because I wanted people to understand that this current homelessness epidemic was created not by some fluke, but by this government failure to follow through on this massive plan. And that failure is why deinstitutionalization has been called one of the biggest public policy failures ever to happen in Canada. And that's why I think it's important to understand that today's epidemic did not just happen by accident. It was actually created. So one of the most damaging myths about homelessness is that people choose to be homeless. In reality, we have what I call a one-size-fits-all shelter system, and it doesn't work for a lot of people. You typically see a large room with bunk beds all lined up in a row. It's loud, it's chaotic, it's not hygienic, and it's very crowded. And a lot of people can't handle it. That's certainly why Margaret rejected shelters. Others reject shelters because of bed bugs. Maybe they've lined up for hours, night after night, only to be turned away, that they've just given up because there were no beds available. And this is a particular problem for homeless women in Hamilton. And I think it's also that way across Canada. And also they reject shelters because they were a victim of violence or they were robbed. And again, this is especially true if they're women. Some have a precious pet, and I know you can look at somebody on Yonge Street with a dog and you say, geez, you know, that's a luxury. That may be the only thing keeping their anxiety at bay. And very, very few shelters take pets, so they end up sleeping on the streets. And the reality is shelters are seriously short-staffed, they're underfunded, and most are just barely managing the problem on shoestring budgets. And I have to say, one of the most alarming statistics I came across was that the average age of death for homeless people in Canada is about 39. That's lower than half the average for the general population. And again, it speaks to the sort of brutality of their lives. They have serious health problems, epilepsy, diabetes, level 4, stage 4 cancers. And by the time they get to the emergency wards, their problems are so overwhelming that, and then they refuse to stay. They're sent home with antibiotics and they're on the street and they forget to take them. So it's really, really a revolving door. Another damaging myth about homelessness, though, is that there's no solution. And this one really makes me crazy. Is the reality is we actually know how to end homelessness. The city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, and the entire country of Finland have shown how it can be done and that it can be done. And the whole key is to provide, and John would know this, housing that has supports tailored to the person's individual needs. And they also need to intervene early, because the longer someone's on the street, the harder they are to reach. And that was certainly the case with Margaret, because a couple of years into being homeless, a friend actually let her stay with him for quite a long time. And even in the middle of winter, she would just walk out to the streets and stay there for days because it just become embedded in her. Another shocking statistic I uncovered is, and this is why Medicine Hat actually decided to launch this homelessness program, is that it costs about anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 to keep someone on the street a year. And I found that just astonishing. And that goes back again to the fact that they use crisis services. I actually talked to a group in Niagara a few weeks ago, and there's a woman there who's been homeless for decades. And they finally decided to do analysis of the costs that it was costing them just to try to get some more help for her. And in about a 1.5 year period, the cost, because she sometimes went to ER 7 or 8 times a day, The cost that it had added up to was $1.2 billion in about an 18-month period. And the reality is it actually can cost, and is in medicine, it's costing about $24,000 to house someone. So this is the point that I try to get across to politicians when I talk to them, is you don't care about the humane sort of reasons, care about the economic. But the reality is, we know the current homelessness crisis is a result of decades of neglect. It will only end when our leaders decide to make a commitment to it. There needs to be the political will, which means we need leaders who will step up and do something. And as I said, we need to tell our politicians to stop wasting money by applying Band-Aid solutions to a problem that has workable and permanent solutions. People need to realize that homeless people lead brutal lives, not just because of their constant battle with hunger and the cold. They feel the indignity of being homeless every time a person walks by them and ignores them. They feel the humiliation every time someone fails to look them in the eye, because it's all a reminder of how little they matter. When I joined the First Unitarian Church of Hamilton more than 20 years ago, one of the things that impressed me was the common bond of respect and compassion between people. No boundaries around race, ethnicity, gender, or ability. And as Unitarians, I saw that we believe in listening to the voices that have been silenced and learning the uncomfortable truths with looking away. And boy, is that the theme of homelessness. I love the value we place on social justice issues and the commitment to helping those who are less fortunate. And I love that our church is a place where we can find both comfort and courage. And we stay strong in supporting others by staying connected with each other. And I think that's why we're able to develop programs like your Pathways program, which just sounds fantastic. Like many of you, I've been asked what Unitarians believe in, and my answer is always, well, the goddess of compassion. And that always brings a smile to their face. It seems to be the easiest way to explain it. I saw that compassion at work in my own church a few years ago when some members discovered people living in tents in an adjoining area of our yard. They set up a group to help and put some things in place. And it was really an example of how our church responds to things. So for homeless people like Margaret, as I said, every day is about surviving the hunger, the assaults, the humiliation. I said Margaret's story is also the story of thousands of others who were homeless back when Margaret was on the streets and are homeless today. And like Margaret, they had a life before their mental illness or some other tragedy took over. And even though Margaret's illness was actually complex, it could be managed with proper supports. And this was shown when she was in the hospital. And I think she could have lived a good life and would still be alive today if those supports had been in place. Instead, when I met her that night, her physical and mental health was so ragged, she looked to be near death. It was only because she had such an incredible spirit and she was a fighter that she somehow managed to live another 2 years. I called my book, Her Name Was Margaret, to remind people that every homeless person you see has a name, that they were once children, as I said, who had dreams, and that either because of an illness or life circumstance combined often with the trauma, their life took a tragic turn. A former minister of my church, Reverend Allison Barrett, attended a memorial service I had for Margaret last December, and she wrote a beautiful poem, and I'd like to share a few words of that. She called it For Margaret. Everyone deserves to be remembered for the best of them, remembered for their music and their soul, for how hard they tried, for the life they gave, for their early promise and undying dignity, for their determination and sheer will to live, for the way they struggled to be understood, for their perseverance in holding their head high while so much around them fell away. It is remembering that makes us human. It is in remembering Margaret that will restore her humanity to its rightful place. I wrote my book to honor Margaret's memory and to ensure that her story won't be forgotten, but it's also a call for compassion and a voice that says we will remember her. Thank you.